December 1944. The Eastern Front had become a frozen graveyard where hope went to die. Major Klaus Bergmann stood among the remnants of his battalion near the Stalingrad region, watching as the Wehrmacht's once mighty advance crumbled into desperate retreat. The temperature had plunged to -30°C. Men were dying faster from frostbite than from Soviet bullets. Around him, the chaos was absolute: soldiers abandoning equipment, officers burning documents, the distant rumble of Soviet artillery growing closer with each passing hour. Bergmann had been assigned to coordinate the withdrawal of his unit through the Siberian wilderness, a task that had become increasingly impossible as supply lines collapsed and communication broke down. On December 18th, during a particularly brutal snowstorm, Bergmann's unit was making its way through dense forest when Soviet forces ambushed them. The firefight was brief but devastating. When the smoke cleared and survivors regrouped at the rally point, Major Klaus Bergmann was not among them. His second-in-command reported him missing, likely killed in action or captured by Soviet forces. No body was recovered. No witnesses could confirm his fate. In the chaos of retreat, with thousands of German soldiers disappearing into the vast Siberian landscape, one missing major seemed unremarkable. The official Wehrmacht record was stark and simple. Major Klaus Bergmann, missing in action, presumed dead. His personal effects were catalogued and prepared for return to his family in Bavaria. His name was added to the growing list of officers lost in the catastrophic Eastern Front collapse. For military purposes, Klaus Bergmann ceased to exist on December 18, 1944. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that somewhere in those frozen forests, Bergmann had made a choice that would keep him hidden from the world for nearly 3 decades. The man who vanished that winter day wasn't dead. He had simply decided to disappear. To understand why a decorated Wehrmacht officer would vanish into the Siberian wilderness, you have to understand who Klaus Bergmann was before the war consumed him. Born in 1,912 inches, a small Bavarian village nestled in the Alpine foothills, Klaus grew up in a Germany still reeling from the Great War. His father was a schoolteacher, his mother a seamstress. They raised him with traditional values: duty, honor, education. Klaus was bright, thoughtful, the kind of boy who spent hours reading philosophy and hiking mountain trails. In 1935, he married Anna Schmidt, a baker's daughter with kind eyes and a sharp wit. They were happy in a way that seemed rare even then. By 1940, they had 2 children, Friedrich, age 4, and little Marguerite, just 18 months old. Klaus adored them. His letters home were filled with sketches and stories, promises of the life they'd build when he returned. But Klaus Bergmann was also a soldier, and a capable one. He joined the Wehrmacht in 1936, partly from genuine patriotic feeling, partly because military service offered stability in uncertain times. He rose through the ranks quickly. His intelligence and tactical skill were undeniable. By 1942, he'd earned his major's insignia. By 1943, he was on the Eastern Front, leading men into battles that grew increasingly hopeless. His letters home changed over those years. The optimism faded. The propaganda phrases disappeared. What remained was a man wrestling with what he'd seen, what he'd been ordered to do, what he was becoming. Anna saved every letter, reading between the lines as her husband's soul seemed to erode with each campaign. The last letter she received was dated December 3, 1944. Klaus wrote about the cold, about missing Friedrich's birthday, about wanting to hear Marguerite's voice. He signed it, "Your Klaus, always." Then silence. Anna waited by the window every day for 2 years before the official notice arrived: missing, presumed dead. She never remarried. She never stopped hoping. What she didn't know was that somewhere in Siberia, her husband was alive and making a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The winter of 1944–45 wasn't just cold, it was apocalyptic. The Eastern Front had become a killing field where nature proved as merciless as any Soviet offensive. Temperatures regularly dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Men's breath froze in their lungs, weapons seized up, vehicles became immobile metal tombs. The Wehrmacht, once a seemingly unstoppable force that had driven deep into Soviet territory, was now in full collapse. What had been an orderly retreat had devolved into a panicked rout. Entire divisions were being encircled and destroyed, supply lines had disintegrated, soldiers were abandoning heavy equipment, desperate just to stay ahead of advancing Soviet forces. In the Stalingrad region alone, tens of thousands of German soldiers had already been killed or captured. The Siberian wilderness became a graveyard without markers. Bodies disappeared under snow, wouldn't be found until spring thaw, if ever. Records were incomplete, chaotic, often destroyed in the retreat. Communication between units had broken down almost entirely. In this context, the disappearance of Major Klaus Bergmann was nothing special. He was one name among thousands. One more officer swallowed by the vastness of the Russian winter. Soviet forces were capturing German soldiers by the hundreds daily, marching them east to prison camps in Siberia and beyond. Many died on these forced marches. Others vanished into the Gulag system, never to be heard from again. Some, driven to desperation, had deserted and tried to survive in the wilderness, only to succumb to exposure or starvation within days. Military investigators, what few remained functional, had neither the time nor resources to search for individual missing soldiers. The priority was survival of remaining forces, not accounting for those already lost. Bergmann's file was marked with the same notation as countless others: MIA, presumed KIA, or POW. His commanding officer wrote a brief, perfunctory report. No investigation followed, no search party was dispatched. In the vast machinery of war's collapse, one missing major simply didn't matter. The Eastern Front consumed men like a furnace, leaving behind only bureaucratic footnotes. Klaus Bergmann had become just another statistic in history's bloodiest conflict. Anna Bergmann refused to believe her husband was dead. Even when the official notice arrived in 1946, even when neighbors whispered she should move on, she kept hoping. She wrote letters to every military office, every Red Cross bureau, every organization that might have information about missing soldiers. The responses were always the same: no record, no information, presumed deceased. She traveled to Munich in 1947 to meet with Wehrmacht records officers. They showed her lists of POWs in Soviet camps. Klaus's name wasn't there. She met with other war widows, compared notes, shared theories. Some husbands had turned up years later, released from remote gulags. But as the years passed, those reunions became rarer. By 1950, Anna had contacted Soviet authorities directly, a dangerous thing to do in those Cold War years. She received no response. Her letters went into a bureaucratic void. Friends urged her to accept reality, to think of her children, to consider remarrying. She refused every suitor. "I made vows," she told her sister. "Until I know for certain, I'm still Klaus's wife." Friedrich and Margaret grew up with a father who was both absent and omnipresent. His photograph sat on the mantel. Anna spoke of him in present tense for years. The children learned not to ask too many questions. In 1956, when the Soviets released thousands of German POWs, Anna went to the train stations, searching faces, holding Klaus's photograph. He wasn't among the gaunt, broken men who stumbled off those trains. Throughout the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, as the war faded from immediate memory into history, Anna's search became quieter but never stopped. She subscribed to newsletters about missing soldiers. She checked new archive releases. She wrote fewer letters but never stopped hoping. She died in 1998, aged 86, still wearing her wedding ring. In her nightstand drawer, Friedrich found decades of correspondence, hundreds of letters to government offices, embassies, archives, all dead ends. Klaus Bergmann's case had gone completely cold. His name existed only in dusty military records and his widow's memory. No one was looking for him anymore. No one expected answers. The world had moved on. August 2024. The Siberian wilderness looks different in summer, though no less unforgiving. Dr. Yevgeny Volkov led a small geological survey team through dense taiga forest, roughly 200 kilometers east of where Stalingrad region transitions into true Siberian wilderness. They were conducting mineral surveys near abandoned World War II-era settlements, mapping terrain that had barely been touched since Soviet logging operations ceased in the 1980 seconds. The area was remote, even by Siberian standards: no roads, no villages, nothing but forest and the occasional crumbling remnant of Stalin-era infrastructure. Volkov's team was using ground-penetrating radar to map subsurface mineral deposits when they detected an anomaly. The readings showed a structural void that didn't match natural cave formations. At first, they assumed it was an old mine shaft or perhaps a collapsed gulag structure. This region had been dotted with prison camps during the war. But when they hiked to the coordinates, pushing through thick underbrush and fallen timber, what they found was something else entirely. Partially concealed by decades of forest growth, camouflaged so well it was almost invisible, was a man-made structure built into a hillside. It wasn't Soviet construction, the techniques were wrong, the materials different. Volkov, who'd worked in these forests for 20 years, had never seen anything quite like it. The entrance was nearly invisible, covered by carefully arranged rocks and vegetation that had grown over it naturally. If not for their radar equipment, they would have walked right past it. When they cleared the entrance enough to peer inside, their headlamps revealed a space that had been sealed for decades. The air that escaped was cold, stale, perfectly preserved by permafrost. Inside, they could see wooden structures, metal objects, the unmistakable signs of human habitation. Volkov's first thought was gulag remnant, perhaps a hidden punishment cell or storage bunker. But something felt wrong. The construction was too careful, too concealed. This wasn't a prison. This was a hideout. Someone had built this place to disappear. And from the German military equipment visible just inside the entrance, that someone had been running from the war. When Volkov's team fully excavated and documented the site over the following weeks, they realized they'd discovered something extraordinary. The hideout was a masterwork of survival engineering, built with remarkable sophistication given the circumstances. The main structure was dug into a south-facing hillside, providing natural insulation and protection from Siberia's brutal north winds. The entrance was positioned behind a natural rock outcropping, invisible from any approach angle. Whoever built this had military training. The tactical advantages were obvious. The shelter itself consisted of multiple chambers carved into the hillside and reinforced with timber. The main living space was roughly 4 meters by 5 meters, with a ceiling high enough to stand in. A smaller chamber branched off, apparently used for food storage. The permafrost had kept it naturally refrigerated. A third tiny room held tools and equipment. The construction technique showed ingenuity born of desperation. Support beams were fashioned from local timber, notched and fitted together with precision. Walls were insulated with moss, clay, and animal hides. A ventilation system had been carefully designed to allow smoke from a small fire pit to escape without being visible from outside. The chimney outlet was concealed among rocks 60 meters upslope, dispersing smoke so it wouldn't create a visible plume. Evidence of long-term habitation was everywhere. Sleeping area, with a platform bed made from pine boughs and leather, shelving carved into the earthen walls. A water collection system that channeled snowmelt into the shelter through carved wooden gutters. The location itself had been chosen with strategic brilliance. A small stream ran 30 meters below, providing year-round water. The forest here was dense with game trails. Natural caves nearby could have provided emergency shelter. Sight lines allowed observation of approaches from 3 directions. This wasn't a desperate man's crude bunker. This was a long-term survival compound built by someone who knew he'd be here for years, someone who had no intention of ever being found. And the artifacts inside would soon reveal exactly who that someone was. The permafrost had done what no archive could. It had preserved everything. As Volkov's team carefully cataloged the contents of the shelter, they were essentially excavating a time capsule from 1944. The first items were unmistakably military. A Wehrmacht officer's greatcoat, moth-eaten but still recognizable, hung from a wooden peg. Beneath it, a uniform tunic with the insignia carefully removed, a Luger pistol, unloaded, wrapped in oiled cloth, a combat knife with a worn handle, dog tags that read, Bergmann, Klaus, Major, Wehrmacht. But it was the personal effects that transformed this from a historical curiosity into something profoundly human. A small leather Bible, pages yellowed and brittle, with passages underlined and margin notes in German. A tin box containing photographs, a young woman with kind eyes, 2 small children, a family portrait from happier times. The photographs had been handled so often they were creased and faded. Most haunting were the letters. Dozens of them, written on scraps of paper, birch bark, anything available, all addressed to Anna, none ever sent. They were dated across years 1945, 1948, 1953, 1960. Love letters written to a wife who would never read them, apologies to children who would grow up without knowing their father's fate. The survival tools told their own story of adaptation and isolation. Improvised fishing hooks carved from bone, snares made from braided plant fiber and scavenged wire. A bow constructed from flexible wood with a string of twisted sinew. Knives fashioned from sharpened metal scraps. Containers made from hollowed wood and bark. Each item spoke to years of solitary resourcefulness, of a man learning to survive where survival seemed impossible. There were trade goods too, Soviet-era metal cups, a few rusted tools that weren't German issue, fabric that suggested contact, however minimal, with the outside world. But the most significant discovery was found wrapped in waterproof oilcloth in the storage chamber. A leather-bound journal, its pages filled with dense German script. Parts had deteriorated, entire sections were illegible, but enough remained, enough to tell Klaus Bergmann's story in his own words. The story of a man who chose exile over everything else. The first legible entry was dated January 7, 1945. Bergmann's handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but his words were clear enough. 3 weeks now since I made my choice. The cold is beyond anything I imagined. I think about Anna and the children constantly. I think about what they've been told, that I'm dead or captured. Perhaps it's better they think me dead. What I've done, what I'm doing, there's no honor in it, only survival. The entries from those first months painted a picture of a man in crisis. Bergmann described the ambush on December 18th in detail, the confusion, the gunfire, the moment he found himself separated from his unit. But he also described what came before. Months of growing horror at what he'd witnessed, orders he'd been forced to carry out, atrocities committed in the name of a regime he'd come to despise. I joined, believing in duty and honor, he wrote in a February entry. I thought we were defending the fatherland, but what I've seen on this front, the executions, the brutality against civilians, the senselessness of it all. We're not soldiers anymore. We're murderers in uniform. I can't do it anymore. I won't. The December ambush had presented him with a split-second decision. He could regroup with survivors and continue the retreat, likely ending up in a Soviet POW camp or executed for war crimes. He could surrender and face trial for atrocities he'd witnessed or participated in. Or he could disappear. "In the chaos, I saw my chance," he wrote. "Bodies everywhere, smoke, confusion. I took what supplies I could carry and moved into the forest. No one saw me go. No one would look for me. Just another casualty in a war already lost." But it wasn't cowardice that drove him, according to his own account. It was something more complex. "I deserve punishment for what I've done, what I've allowed, but I won't give them the satisfaction, not the Soviets who want revenge, not the Nazis who'd execute me for desertion. I choose my own exile, my own prison. Out here, alone with my conscience, that's punishment enough." The journal entries from January through March 1945 read like a survival manual written by a man teetering on the edge of death. Bergman documented everything with the precision of his military training, as if recording these strategies might give his suffering meaning. "The first rule of surviving Siberian winter, never let yourself sweat," he wrote in late January. "Moisture is death. I learned this watching wolves. They move efficiently, never wasting energy. I do the same now." He described his initial shelter, a crude cave he'd found and fortified before building the permanent hideout that summer. Those first months were a desperate education in wilderness survival. He studied animal tracks in the snow, learned which berries the birds ate, observed how foxes cached food. He set primitive traps, failed repeatedly, adjusted techniques. His first successful rabbit kill came after 3 weeks of trying. "I wept when I caught it," he admitted, "not from joy, from the weight of what I'd become. An officer reduced to grubbing in the snow like an animal. February nearly killed him." He detailed a 3-day blizzard where temperatures dropped so low his shelter filled with frost despite his fire. He burned his last reserve of German military documents to stay warm, watching his identity literally go up in smoke. In March, he contracted what he believed was pneumonia. Fever for 6 days. Hallucinations. "I saw Anna and the children, spoke to them, they felt real. When the fever broke, I was almost disappointed to find myself still here, still alone." But something shifted as winter gave way to spring. His entries became more observational, less desperate. He described encountering what appeared to be traces of indigenous Evenki people, old campsites, hunting markers. "I watched them from distance," he wrote in May. "They move through this land like they're part of it. I'm still fighting it. I need to learn." Over months, he did learn, not through direct contact, but through careful observation and trial and error. He improved his trapping techniques, learned to identify edible plants, discovered how to preserve meat through smoking and drying. By his first autumn in the wilderness, Klaus Bergman had transformed from a Wehrmacht officer into something else entirely, a ghost surviving in the margins of the world. The journal entries through the 1,950 seconds revealed a man grappling with isolation that would have broken most people. The technical survival details gave way to increasingly philosophical reflections. In 1947, Bergman wrote, 3 years now. Sometimes days pass where I don't speak aloud. I've forgotten the sound of my own voice in conversation. I talk to Anna's photograph. I know it's madness, but it's the only thing keeping me human. The guilt permeated everything. Entry after entry circled back to what he'd done, what he'd witnessed, what he'd failed to prevent. I dream of villages we passed through, he wrote in 1949. The faces of civilians. The orders I followed because I was too much of a coward to refuse. Out here, I've escaped the war, but not what it made me. This isolation, it's both punishment and refuge. Why didn't he try to return? The journal laid out his reasoning with painful clarity. The war ended in 1945. He wrote in 1951, having pieced together information from scraps of Soviet newspapers he'd scavenged. Germany is divided, occupied, Even if I could make it back, what awaits me? War crimes tribunals, execution, at best, prison. And Anna, how could I face her? How could I explain that I chose this, that I've been alive all this time while she mourned? The shame was worse than the guilt. "I'm not a hero who escaped," he wrote in 1953. "I'm a deserter, a coward who abandoned his post, his men, his family. There's no redemption for that. No going back. Every year I survive out here is another year I prove I chose this. Chose to live while others died. Chose myself over everyone I loved." But the entries also revealed unexpected moments of peace. He described sunrises over the taiga that took his breath away, the satisfaction of a successful hunt, the meditative quality of daily survival routines. Perhaps this is what humans were meant for, he reflected in 1956. Not war, not civilization with all its cruelty. Just this living close to the earth, taking only what you need, leaving no trace. I'm more at peace here than I ever was in the world of men. The artifacts in the shelter told a story the journal only hinted at. Klaus Bergman hadn't been completely alone all those years. Among his possessions were items he couldn't have made himself. Soviet-era tin cups from the 1952, a metal axe head of Russian manufacture, cloth that wasn't military issue, a hunting knife with Cyrillic markings. The journal entries from the late 1952 onward contained cryptic references to the old hunter and occasional exchanges. In 1958, Bergman wrote, "He appeared today while I was checking traps. An Evenki elder, must be 70. We stared at each other for a long moment. He showed no surprise, as if he'd known I was here all along. He left 2 dried fish on a rock and walked away. I left tobacco in return from supplies I still had cached. We didn't speak. We didn't need to." Over the years, a pattern emerged from the entries. The indigenous people who moved through this territory seasonally knew about the German living in the forest. They chose not to reveal him. They understand exile, Bergman reflected in 1961. "They've seen what civilization does to people. They see me as harmless now, just another creature in the forest. The old hunter brings me salt sometimes, takes nothing in return. I think he feels sorry for me." The trades were minimal, infrequent, always wordless. A few tools in exchange for German equipment that still had value. Medicine once, when Bergman injured his leg badly in 1963. Information. Occasionally the hunter would draw in the dirt, showing him where game was moving or warning him about Soviet patrols in the region. But why keep his secret? The journal suggested reasons. "They have no love for Soviet authority," Bergman wrote. "They've been pushed from their traditional lands, forced into settlements, treated as backward, a German hiding in their forest. It's not their concern. Besides, after all these years, I'm not really German anymore. I'm not really anything. Just a ghost they sometimes acknowledge." The Soviet-era goods suggested other contact too. Perhaps a logger who'd wandered too far from his crew. Maybe a hunter who'd stumbled upon the hideout, but no one reported him. No authorities came. In Siberia's vast emptiness, one old hermit wasn't worth the effort. His location remained hidden not through elaborate concealment, but through simple irrelevance and the silent complicity of the few who knew. The journal entries from the late 1960s showed a man in decline. The handwriting became shakier, the dates more sporadic. Months would pass between entries. "My hands don't work like they used to," Bergman wrote in 1967. "Arthritis, I think. The cold has gotten into my bones after all these years. I'm 65 now. An old man who's been old for a very long time." The entries grew darker as his body failed him. In 1969, "Fell today while hunting, lay in the snow for an hour before I could stand. If this happens in winter, I'll freeze before I make it back to shelter. I need to accept what's coming." He wrote about pain that never went away, about struggling with tasks that had once been routine. Setting traps became difficult. Hunting was nearly impossible. He relied more on the occasional gifts from the Evenki elder, on stored supplies, on rationing what little he had. In 1970, the entries revealed him taking stock of his life. 26 years in this wilderness. Anna is 72 now, if she's still alive. Friedrich would be 34. Marguerite, 31. Do they have families? Do they ever think of me? Or have I faded into nothing, just a name they barely remember? The last dated entry was from December 1972. The handwriting was barely legible, the words wandering across the page. The cold is inside me now, not outside, inside. I feel it in my chest. The old hunter hasn't come in months. Perhaps he's dead too. We're all dying out here the old ways, the old ghosts. But before that final entry, there were notes that suggested preparation. He'd organized his possessions carefully, placed his dog tags prominently near the entrance. He'd wrapped Anna's letters in oilcloth and stored them where they'd be preserved. Most tellingly, he'd written on a separate piece of bark, "To whoever finds this place, my name is Klaus Bergmann. I was born in Bavaria in 1912. I have been here by my own choice since 1944. Tell my family I thought of them every day. Tell them, I'm sorry." He knew he was dying. He knew winter 1972 would be his last, and he wanted, finally, to be found. In the deepest chamber of the shelter, Volkov's team found what they'd expected but hoped not to find. Human remains, partially mummified by the cold, lay on the wooden sleeping platform. The body was positioned deliberately lying on its back, hands folded across the chest, covered with what remained of the Wehrmacht greatcoat. Even in death, Klaus Bergmann had maintained his dignity. The Russian authorities were notified immediately. What had been a geological survey had become a death investigation, albeit one 8 decades in the making. A forensic team arrived from Novosibirsk within days. The remains were carefully excavated and transported for analysis. The permafrost had preserved enough tissue for examination, though decomposition had progressed during the brief Siberian summers over the decades. Initial forensic assessment suggested the individual had been male, approximately 60 to 65 years old at time of death, consistent with someone born around 1912. Skeletal analysis showed old fractures, a broken collarbone, fractured ribs, injuries consistent with both military service and wilderness survival, signs of severe arthritis in the hands and knees, evidence of malnutrition in the final years. The dental records were crucial. Wehrmacht military files, meticulously maintained even through the war's chaos, contained Klaus Bergmann's dental chart. The match was unmistakable, the filling patterns, the missing molar, even an old chip on an incisor. But DNA testing would provide absolute confirmation. Through international cooperation, German authorities located Bergmann's surviving family. Friedrich had died in 2015, but his daughter, Klaus's granddaughter, provided a DNA sample. Marguerite was still alive, now 85, living in a care facility near Munich. She, too, agreed to testing, though she barely remembered the father who'd vanished when she was 18 months old. The results came back in October 2024, 8 months after the initial discovery. 99.9% certainty. The remains found in the Siberian hideout were definitively those of Major Klaus Bergmann, missing since December 1944. Time of death was estimated at late 1972 or early 1973, based on decomposition analysis and the dated journal entries. He'd survived in that wilderness for 28 years. 28 winters. Nearly 3 decades of self-imposed exile. The world had moved on. The war had ended. Germany had been divided and reunified. Entire generations had been born and grown old. And through it all, Klaus Bergmann had been alone in the Siberian forest, living with his choices until they finally killed him. The phone call came to Friedrich's daughter Elena on a cold morning in November 2024. A German government official explaining that her grandfather, dead for 80 years according to family history, had been found. Not in a mass grave or prisoner of war camp, but in a self-built shelter in Siberia where he'd lived until 1972. Elena didn't believe it at first, couldn't process it. Her father had died never knowing what happened to Klaus, had spent his childhood waiting for a father who was alive but had chosen not to return. When she finally absorbed the news, her first call was to her great-aunt Marguerite. At 85, Marguerite had no real memories of her father, just photographs and her mother's stories. "He was alive all that time?" Marguerite whispered when Elena told her. "Mama waited her whole life. She died in 1998, still hoping. And he was out there, alive, for decades after the war ended. He could have come home." The emotions were complicated, contradictory, impossible to untangle. Relief that they finally knew. Anger that he'd chosen to stay hidden. Sadness for the life he'd lived, for the family he'd abandoned, for Anna who died never knowing the truth. When the personal effects were returned to the family, the photographs, the dog tags, the Bible, it was the letters that destroyed them. Dozens of letters written to Anna across nearly 3 decades. Letters filled with love, longing, apology, explanation. Letters that said everything Anna had needed to hear, but never would. "My dearest Anna," one from 1955 began. "Another spring has come. I wonder if you're tending the garden like you used to. I think about you every morning when I wake, every night before I sleep. I know what I've done to you is unforgivable. I pray you've moved on, found happiness. But I also pray you remember me, that I haven't been completely erased. I'm still yours, even if you can never be mine again." Elena read them aloud to Marguerite in the care facility. Both women wept. "He loved her," Marguerite said finally. "He loved all of us, but not enough to come back." That was the cruelest truth. Klaus had survived 28 years alone rather than face the consequences of desertion, the judgment of his choices, the shame of what he'd become. He'd chosen exile over redemption, chosen silence over explanation. The family arranged for his remains to be returned to Germany. He was buried in Bavaria, in the family plot next to Anna. 80 years after he disappeared, Klaus Bergmann finally came home. Klaus Bergmann's story raises questions that have no easy answers. What drives a man to choose 28 years of isolation over facing the consequences of his actions? What kind of guilt is so overwhelming that exile in the Siberian wilderness seems preferable to returning home? Psychologists who reviewed his journal entries identified classic symptoms of what we now call moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when someone violates their own ethical code or witnesses acts that contradict their fundamental beliefs. For Bergmann, the war had shattered his sense of who he was. Returning would have meant confronting not just legal consequences, but the complete collapse of his self-image. In the wilderness, he could be no one. And perhaps that was easier than being who he'd become. The isolation itself was its own punishment. As he'd written, 28 years without meaningful human connection, without hearing his children's voices, without holding his wife. The journal revealed a man who slowly went mad in the quietest way possible, not through delusion, but through the grinding weight of solitude. He functioned, survived, even found moments of peace. But he was never whole again. Bergmann wasn't unique. Thousands of German soldiers vanished on the Eastern Front and were never accounted for. Some died in unmarked graves. Some disappeared into the Soviet Gulag system. But others, how many others, simply walked away, chose the wilderness over captivity, exile over justice, silence over explanation. We'll never know how many. The Siberian landscape is vast enough to swallow entire armies. Even today, hikers occasionally discover remains, artifacts, forgotten shelters. Each discovery represents a life lived at the margins, a story that ended in isolation. The Russian government has designated Bergman's shelter as a historical site. It's too remote for tourism, but it's been documented, preserved, studied. Historians see it as a window into the desperate final days of the Eastern Front. Anthropologists examine it as an example of extreme survival adaptation. Psychologists analyze the journal as a case study in isolation and guilt. But perhaps the real legacy is simpler and more human. Klaus Bergman's story reminds us that war doesn't end when the fighting stops. It continues in the minds of those who survived it, in the families who waited for answers that never came, in the choices people make when every option feels impossible. He lived for 28 years because he was too ashamed to die and too afraid to return. In the end, the Siberian winter took him, as it had taken so many others. But unlike the thousands who disappeared without trace, Klaus Bergman left behind a record. His journal, his letters, his carefully preserved hideout, they all testify to one undeniable truth. He never forgot who he was or who he'd left behind. The tragedy is that he chose to be remembered as missing rather than face being known as the man he'd become. War makes ghosts of men long before they die. Klaus Bergman became a ghost in December 1944 and remained one until his body was discovered 80 years later. Now, finally, he can rest, and his family, after 8 decades, finally has their answer. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.